The disappearance of the Society of the Organization of Adventurers is, in some ways, more of a mystery than the Tater Pond monster itself. While the many letters left behind by Kenneth Vonderblow don't reveal the group's ultimate fate, they do provide a window into the events preceding it. Scholars have used these letters to piece together much of the story. On the morning of the first full day at Tater Pond, the SOA began by examining the pond itself. Their first course of action was to test the water to see if they could detect any residual traces of anything out of the ordinary. Normally this would be done by taking samples of the water and analyzing those samples through a variety of methods. Many of those methods are chemical-based, although others may involve mechanical or electrical means. The SOA didn't have access to these methods, so they resorted to a more classic method. After a round of paper, rock, scissors, Toots McMicken was chosen to stick his face into the pond and drink the water to see if he tasted anything strange. To their surprise, he wasn't able to detect unusual flavors, at least nothing that he could associate with a monster. What he did discover a bit later, however, was that Tater Pond was home to a wide variety of bacteria. McMicken would spend much of his time in the woods alone, his body racked with discomfort and forceful diarrhea. In his letters, Kenneth Vonderblow described it as an affliction that ensures that Toots lives up to his rather questionable nickname. The next step was to take pictures of both Tater Pond and the area around it. Kenneth Vonderblow took between 50 to 60 shots. In his letters, he wrote that many of them showed undeniable evidence of the existence of the monster. He was excited to show them to skeptics as firm proof that no one could possibly deny. Unfortunately for Vonderblow and his dreams of vindication, when the film was later developed, it was revealed that he had forgotten to remove the lens cap for every single picture taken. When these images were later examined by an expert photographer, he described them as, quote, "the dumbest thing I've ever seen, and how highly improbable that someone could fucking not take the cap off for almost 60 photos in a row." Day one of the expedition came to an end without much to show for their efforts. However, when the SOA turned in for the night, they did so determined to make the most of the next day. After a good night's sleep and before the sun had risen in the sky, they met to discuss how to proceed.
Going into the investigation, the Society of the Organization of Adventurers had only had two ideas: drink the pond water and take pictures. With both of those ideas exhausted, they were at a loss as to how to continue on. It was while they were desperately trying to come up with something, anything, that the mosquitoes arrived.
The SOA was completely unprepared for the insects. In one of his final letters, Kenneth Vonderblow described the incident. "Who would have thought that there would be mosquitoes by a pond in the woods on a hot day in August?" Having tried all two things they had prepared for, and all of them itching for mosquito bites, the SOA decided to make the trek back to civilization. They packed up their camping supplies and started towards town. Despite there being clearly marked trails by this point in time, they somehow became lost. They wandered for upwards of half an hour before realizing that they were unlikely to find the way out of the forest. Their only hope was to be rescued, and they needed to survive long enough for a rescue party to find them. Difficult choices had to be made.
The Society of the Organization of Adventurers turned to cannibalism in a surprisingly short amount of time. It wasn't like it was even necessary. When their packs were recovered, there was enough food in them for at least a week. It was like one of them had said that they were hungry, another immediately suggested cannibalism, and everyone agreed without even considering other options. After a vote, the group determined that Robert Toots McMicken would be the first one eaten. Kenneth Vonderblau wrote that McMicken was surprisingly calm about the whole thing, accepting his fate and saying that he was just happy to be useful. Believing that they had staved off starvation, the remaining 3 SOA members settled in to wait to be rescued.
What they had forgotten was that McMicken had been infected by bacteria from drinking pond water the day before. By eating him, the others had brought that infection into their own bodies. Soon they were all afflicted by heavy cramping and diarrhea. In his final letter, Kenneth Vonderblau wrote that he hadn't considered that eating a person could possibly be a negative experience. The letter, quite graphically, explained the odd sensation of vomiting and expelling waste at the same time. When his writings eventually made their way to his wife, this particular letter was unfortunately the one that she opened and read first. She remarked to a neighbor that there were times that she wished that her husband hadn't been literate. When park rangers discovered the campsite, they found all the SOA's supplies, as well as the remains of Robert McMicken. Donald Nance, Molly Thomas, and Kenneth Vonderblau had disappeared. A thorough search of the woods was conducted, but neither they nor any trace of them was ever found. The locals had a number of theories about what may have happened. Perhaps, while delirious from dehydration and their minds affected by pond water bacteria, they had simply wandered off into the woods and died somewhere remote or where their bodies weren't seen by the search parties. Another theory speculated that, due to practically every member of the Tuggers Peak Police Department being spotted drinking heavily before going to the campsite and while at the campsite, they had been too drunk to see their own hands, let alone bodies in the woods. It is a third possibility that many of the locals subscribe to, however. They believe that the SOA couldn't have just vanished into thin air. They believe that Donald Nance, Molly Thomas, and Kenneth Vonderblau became the latest victims of the Tater Pond Monster. Since the Society of the Organization of Adventurers Expedition, there have been no further group investigations of Tater Pond. Fearing that the possibility of having a man-eating monster made the area too dangerous, the pond was declared off-limits to visitors by Mayor Quinton McCheese in 1973. While the McCheese family declined to provide a comment on the mayor's imposed restrictions, they did ask that we clarify that their last name is McCheese with a Z rather than an S, so as not to be confused with the popular McDonaldland character. Beyond the occasional sighting from a local that wandered too deep into the woods, usually due to alcohol and a terrible sense of direction, Sussy has remained quiet since the SOA expedition. All requests for access to Tater Pond have been denied, and the people of Tuggers Peak have been content to let sleeping monsters lie. Is there really a monstrous creature calling Tater Pond home? Was the Society of the Organization of Adventurers expedition failure the result of stupidity and incompetence as it first appears? Or did they encounter something that they were not prepared to deal with? What is fact, and what is fiction when it comes to Sussy? We were determined to find out the truth. We here at the Nightfall Institute decided that the only way to discover what has been plaguing Tuggers Peak for a century and a half was to mount our own expedition to Tater's Pond. While there are restrictions on access to it, and our request for an exemption from these restrictions was not granted, we determined that the truth outweighed potential legal ramifications. One fall afternoon in November, our small group arrived in Tuggers Peak and ventured into the woods. This is what we found. We found nothing because our crew was almost immediately arrested for trespassing. Tater Pond had once again kept its secrets. Does a monster live under its waves? We may never know for sure. There are some things that we do know for sure, however. We know that the community of Tugger's Peak believes that something beyond our understanding lives in those woods. We know that a number of people have lost their lives in their search for the truth, and that those who are left behind honor their memories. At the beginning, we stated that the time would come for you to form your own opinions. Now is that time. Do you believe that Sussy is a real creature that inhabits Tater Pond to this day? Or do you believe that it's simply a hoax perpetuated by a town with a higher alcohol content than most breweries that is looking to cash in on a local legend? Thank you for watching the Nightfall Investigates, the legend of the Tater Pond Monster. Remember to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And above all, remember, trespassing is a serious crime, and if you engage in it, you will be forced to state that it is a serious crime at the end of your documentary as part of your court agreement.